Hey everyone, welcome to CTF Radio. I'm Adam D, and I have with me, as always, Zardus. Zardus, you want to say hi?
Hey everybody.
And we have a very special episode, although I guess I feel at this point where all of our episodes are special. I guess we don't do any regular run-of-the-mill episodes. Is that true, Jan?
Where we just what would a regular run-of-the-mill episode be?
I don't know. CTFs are always fun.
Last weekend. Exactly.
Last weekend in CTF, that'd be pretty good. I think if somebody did a news...
That would be actually pretty good.
News-style CTF about who won what and who played what CTFs and what CTFs are upcoming. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, we should actually...
Yeah? That's cool.
Yeah. Think about how to make that work. Anyways.
Cool. Yeah, so today we have before we kind of introduce our guests, so the topic of today, we're going to be talking about basically the merging of education and CTFs, right? So how can we best, there's a high level problem, and we've both seen this as educators, of how do you train the next generation of people in CTFs? How do you make it so that not in CTFs, but in security. So how do you develop security skills among students and people, or people who don't really understand security? How can you bring them up to speed and bring them into the security realm? And so I think we're going to be talking about a lot of different aspects of that, specifically around CTFs, because that's the area that we love to focus on. And so to help us kind of... Yeah, please, John.
I was going to say, as for those that haven't watched maybe our origin stories and so forth episodes, basically, as we observed earlier, Adam got into CTF through cybersecurity education. I actually got into cybersecurity education through CTF. So it's CTF and cybersecurity education are very linked.
Yeah, that's funny. So you were educated in cybersecurity through CTFs, basically, and I was educated in security through CTFs. Wait, no, I said the same thing twice. Okay, cool. That's awesome. I don't know what I was going for there, but I thought there was something clever. But sometimes, you got to take some swings, otherwise you won't make any hits. So
yeah, exactly.
Cool. So to help us talk about this today, we have Fabian. You may know him better as LiveOverflow. He's coming, and we're really excited to have him on. I mean, I could talk, I guess, for a long time about how amazingly famous you are and how much internet points you have with the YouTube videos and all that stuff. But rather than me talk about that, maybe it'd be better if you could introduce yourself.
Oh, hello. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be on this podcast because I think it's an amazing project, and I'm very looking forward to all the upcoming episodes of this.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate that. It's only, I think maybe the boring episodes are when it's just Jan and I chatting. I think for us, we get boring. It can get boring over time, us talking to each other. We'll just go over the same topics over and over. So we really appreciate
exactly.
We really appreciate you, joining us today. We appreciate you listening. We appreciate anybody else out there who's listening or watching. It means a lot. And so, so maybe I can start off by asking you kind of, how did you get into security and CTF, since that's going to be kind of the theme of what we're talking about here?
Yeah. So there was a time where I started to learn a little bit about security, mostly web security, because I've been doing web development stuff. But it was really hard to learn anything, really. I was in university at the time. And then one day on Hacker News, there was a blog article shared from Stripe, the payment processor, and they were doing a recruitment CTF thing, the Stripe CTF. And that's the one that I discovered. And it was about basic buffer overflow stuff. And that just hooked me immediately. And that article also then redirected to IO Smash the Stack and war games and CTFs in general. And yeah, just from there, that was the trigger. From there, everything exploded.
That's amazing. So do you know when roughly, what year that was?
That was 2012, early 2012.
Wow, so Stripe CTF 2012. So, and then how did you come across the CTF? Is it friends that sent it to you, or?
No, it was Hacker News. Somebody shared the blog article that the CTF is happening.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and then for a while I would only play war games, and it took me a bit to really find or get into the regular CTFs with CTF time and everything.
I see.
Probably easily a year or so. I've been just doing war games.
Did you find that the reason for that was just CTFs were unapproachable, and war games helped you build that up? Why that year gap?
Oh, just think I didn't realize that there's something like a CTF community playing these kind of things. I'm sure I must have stumbled over CTF time before, but I feel like I didn't quite understand like how it would work or so, like external events organized somehow. Stumbling or researching a war game, having a website where I can just sign up and play some challenges was just easy and made sense. I think it just took a while to realize like how the community is kind of set up.
And so did you focus on like web style CTF challenges or binary style?
No, I mean I had already web experience, but through the Stripe CTF with buffer overflows and then IO smash the stack, I was introduced into the binary exploitation areas, and then but then on the board games I've been like playing W3 Charles, web challenges and crypto challenges, crack me, this kind of stuff.
Cool. So kind of trying to become a jack of all trades in some sense, right? Not to.
Yeah, that is also a little bit my problem, but also what I really like, just jumping around stuff. I have always phases. So that was the phase where I was really into binary exploitation. And I think I have since then never been that focused on that topic and focused on other stuff. Yeah.
That's awesome. And so did you then join a team? How did you kind of then get into the CTF scene?
Oh, that took ages. For many years, I've been just like playing alone, like when CTFs were coming up or so. I just like the challenges and trying to solve, difficult things for me that I was then actually able to solve. Like that was just such a good, rewarding feeling. And CTF team, I only found actually, there was a German competition called the Cybersecurity Challenge Germany, where individuals would participate. And out of weird reason how it happens, somehow those finalists and people that were left over started to form a new CTF team, and that became the Alles CTF team. And since then, I've been playing with Alles. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, Alles. I think Alice CTF was in the last 2 or 3 months, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys host. Yeah, and a bunch of my students actually played. Not just Shellfish, but my actual like undergraduate students.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
And what motivated them to play, Jan? Were they just seeking out CTFs for their own fun and enjoyment?
Yeah, so maybe that's probably part of it. No, I maybe you're jumping a little ahead, but in my course this year, I give 1% of extra credit to the final grade per weekend of CTF that they play.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I like that.
Cool. We can use that as like a teaser of where we're going to get to in a bit. But
Exactly.
Before we get there, I think I want to kind of learn more about our guest and kind of his journey. So then can you take us in? So then how did all of this, YouTube videos and streaming and this, like, I guess first question would be, where did the handle come from? So where's the LiveOverflow handle coming from?
Yeah. So maybe I have to start like one step before that.
Yep.
And that was, I was kind of like hitting a wall with like war games. I couldn't really progress anymore. The topics got more complicated. Things like return-oriented programming also felt like inaccessible to me. But I had this feeling that I would understand it. I just needed somebody to explain it to me. I just felt like I was running against a wall and I just couldn't progress. And then one day I stumbled over GeoHot live streaming himself some challenges. I think it was over the wire challenges or something. Yeah. I didn't see it live. I only saw a recording afterwards. But that like blew my mind because that was the first time in my life that I looked somebody else over the shoulder, some like other professionals. So like even in coding that I've done before, I would never see like somebody else program or so. It just didn't happen. And the same thing for security. And so seeing him, how he uses the terminal, how he writes his little exploit scripts and so forth, that just like opened up everything for me. And that was the thing that pushed me through. And then I thought, this is so incredibly amazing. I learned so much through that. I want to give this to other people too. I'm not on GeoHot's level, but I've already like gone through the basics of buffer overflows and stuff. Maybe I can provide the same thing on a lower level for the people after me. And then I also started with live streaming. the exploitexercises.com challenges, Protostar, now Exploit Education. And so I needed a name, and then I was live streaming and then live. And then because I was doing buffer overflows, it was LiveOverflow.
Amazing. Yeah, isn't that funny how you kind of make up this name that, and actually I've heard, to tie it into education, I got similar advice about naming a course. If you're going to name a course for the first time, name it very broad so that you can change it easily in the future, right? So yeah, it's kind of funny, like the LiveOverflow name, it's like, it's a good name. Like the live part's great and the overflow is great, but now when you extend, you're posting XSS on Google search videos and these kinds of things. So yeah, but I think people can still see the genesis there, so it makes sense. That's really interesting. And so how did that experience go then? And I guess maybe you can talk, a little bit. I mean, I've done a little bit of this, and I wonder, what's kind of your process like, especially in the beginning when you were first kind of streaming these things live? Did it change the way you approach problems? Are you thinking differently? Maybe you can put us in the mind of LiveOverflow.
So the big takeaways from me streaming were, first of all, that I was not as entertaining as GeoHot. Like I could not like try to have active work and then still have some kind of funny commentary or witty thing or something.
But it's to be fair, I think very few people are as entertaining as GeoHot.
Yeah, absolutely. But
is a special individual in that regard.
Yeah, and so I realized I would not watch my own streams. I thought they were so boring and terrible. It did not feel like how I was watching GeoHot, and so I didn't like that. The other thing that I took away was that when I tried these exploit exercises challenges, I've solved them before. There was a little bit of time in between, but I knew roughly the solution. But I was still constantly running into issues, and I wasn't able to just like straight away solve them. And especially when I tried to explain what I was doing, I realized I did not actually understand what I was doing. And so I had this realization, this typical thing, like if you can explain it, then you really understood it. And I realized I didn't really understand it.
Yeah, I think that's, I'll interject a little bit. I know maybe Jan feels similarly, but my background was always kind of web and web CTFs and that kind of stuff. And so, I knew binary exploitation and those things, but it really wasn't until I taught a class on and part of the things we covered was, modern binary exploitation that I really got good at it, because you have to, I think the key, it comes down to explaining it to people. So you get to a step and you'd be like, okay, why is this happening? Or why did I get this error? And it's not just enough to understand how to fix it. You really want to understand why did it happen so that you can prepare for it better in the future. And I'm constantly learning these kinds of things as I go to teach something. I think my favorite one was when I finally learned about, was it the red zone in x86-64, where you...
I was about to talk about the red zone.
Talk about
in
it.
That, like, yeah. I learned, so I'd always been aware. Anyways, you go talk about the red zone.
Oh, well, so I was, a lot of my, and this is part of this weird trade-off when you get into education, especially when you're delivering courses and lectures. It takes so much effort, as we'll talk later, I'm sure, to develop these resources. And so once you're kind of locked in, it becomes very painful to then say, okay, I know all this content works, and sure, it's for 32-bit x86. Do I really want to spend the time to go through everything and update it to 64-bit, which I know is the future? It's not like the concepts are going to be fundamentally different. It's easy to delude yourself into that thinking, but the details do shift, right? And so I was one winter upgrading all my slides over to 64-bit, and I kept seeing behavior that I could not explain. And so then I had to dig in and either talk to Jan or Fish to be like, what is going on here? Or the other thing that bit me, I think, was jumping into some return to libc stuff I was doing, and the stack was misaligned, and then that would cause XMM register errors and stuff. And I'm just like, you see this error and it doesn't make any sense. You're like, this works, this exact code works.
There's a seg fault, but the memory is mapped, right?
It's crazy. So yeah, that's anyways, so go back to the red zone. The red zone is basically this feature of x86-64, and it's part of the ISA or something that says the stack, certain bytes under the stack are guaranteed to not be touched. So this means that if you have, I think, a leaf function that doesn't call anything else, it can use parts of the stack that it hasn't actually allocated. So it hasn't moved the stack pointer down to officially allocate those values, but you can still use those values in the function. So you'd be looking at code and be like, wait a minute, how could it so I have this slide that says, the stack pointer's here, and I always have a high memory at the top and low memory at the bottom. So the stack pointer's here, and anything above the stack pointer is essentially allocated memory, and anything below it is garbage. And then later on, I'm going through an example step by step, showing it accessing memory that's lower than the stack pointer. And so you need to understand why in order to not, contradict yourself.
That's the exact same thing that happened to me mid-lecture. And like I've seen it. It hasn't been important enough to explain it to anyone in the past. But now that I'm walking someone through a function using its stack, and I'm like, and then wait a second, right? And it is just enough to like, jar you out of your routine teaching, and it's just, it pops up a lot actually. I find that it pops up for me an enormous amount with heap vols, right? I mean, I wouldn't call myself a hyper expert on the heap, but we've created how to heap back in my day with Shellfish. A lot of heap challenges in CTFs, etc. I've taught the heap multiple times, and yet every time I go and teach it, there's just these subtleties of confusion, like that the last 8 bytes of an allocation overlap with the previous size field of the next allocation. This sort of stuff every time just destroys you, and you just have to be like 100% on top of things because it all folds together. If you mix that up, and then you go on to talk about how one poison null byte attacks work on the heap, it doesn't make sense without that overlap. If you talk about exactly the ranges of the different Tcache bins, it doesn't make sense without that overlap. It's insane how much you have to have everything like, in your mind and ready to go. Like you said, yeah, if you don't know something, I mean, the best way to know something is to sit down and explain it to someone.
Yeah, exactly. Which then kind of maybe brings us full circle. So, Fabian, I'm kind of interested. Do you think? So you mentioned earlier that it was kind of you were doing war games and stuff on your own, and so did you feel that perhaps maybe what drew you to to being to appreciating seeing these streams is the fact that you didn't have people that you were working with? Because that is honestly one of the ways I learned the most when playing in CTFs is being in a room with everyone and working like side by side with somebody, and maybe they don't even have a laptop or computer, but one person's driving and you're both kind of going through and exploiting things. So do you think that kind of maybe was a component there?
Yeah. I think I never thought about it that way, but now that you just mentioned it, I do think that I was heavily relying on online teaching resources and trying to find them and thinking that they were bad. Like I would learn a certain concept the hard way, and then afterwards I would think, why did they explain it not better? Mm-hmm. Like, why was it explained this terrible? That was kind of like constantly my experience.
Yeah,
and then of course trying to do it better than
yeah, that's fascinating. And so okay, so then and I really what I really like about that your story is kind of the drive that it shows to identify let's say a gap or a problem that exists in the world that hey, it's kind of a pain to learn a lot of these security concepts from either. I think write-ups are one of a pretty bad way for new people to learn about security things, and kind of seeing an example of something that hey, this streaming thing and watching somebody actually do it is super useful, and then actually then going and kind of filling that gap yourself. So maybe can you talk about how that evolved over time? So it was first kind of you going through the exploit things of stuff that you've already known, and so how is your approach to kind of streaming and doing this type of thing evolve over time?
Yeah, so there was a pretty quick evolution in the first 6 months or so, I would say, and since then I've kind of found my way of doing it. In the beginning I started with live streaming my stuff, and then I realized I was kind of bad at live streaming, but I was still experimenting with actually then playing CTFs. Like at this time, I already knew that CTFs were happening, and I tried to just completely record myself working on challenges, even if it would take like hours, and then try to edit that after the fact and maybe add some commentary or so, like trying different processes. But still, those videos were like awful to watch. I mean, it was the typical CTF experience. I would spend like 5 hours on a challenge and at the end give up because I got stuck or something. I still thought like there's educational value in that, just to show how long these things take, that everybody Googles around, that it's normal to get stuck and fail at these challenges. Like I still felt like there was value, but eventually I realized that I can explain it very well when I actually write a script and write out exactly what I want to show. And then that slowly transformed into then making CTF video write-ups and also like a kind of like a course, a tutorial, step-by-step binary exploitation stuff, where I just would like very deliberately think about what I want to say and what I want to show and how I want to visualize it and so forth. Yeah.
That's awesome. So then I guess that brings us right to kind of the main topic about, so basically you kind of started in this direction with the live streaming and then pivoted a little bit more towards, let's say like, I don't know, more...
I call them scripted videos.
Scripted videos. Okay. Yeah. So, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Of you can kind of distill things down. So then, okay, then kind of the high goal is, so you're doing this to help people understand, how to approach things, how to approach these security concepts in a, let's say a better, more interactive way than just reading kind of a text write-up.
Yeah, my motivation was always, or like one part of the motivation or design goals for making my videos, make the videos how I wanted to watch them, and liking my own videos. And I didn't like the live streams, I didn't like my CTF raw recordings, but these scripted videos turned out to be something that I even enjoy, like rewatching myself. And then I felt like I got it.
Cool, that's awesome. So then, okay, then general topics. So then what other, I guess maybe one thing we can start talking about is, why do you feel that kind of videos are a good medium for learning about security topics, maybe in contrast with some of the write-ups that you were reading and text documents?
I think it's, first of all, a different medium, and there are different people that learn differently. So I don't want to like disregard like write-ups or text tutorials or whatever at all. Just for me, write-ups work. It's an article, it's pretty short, but for example, I have never learned with books. I have not read a single like security book. I just cannot get myself, it doesn't work. And I felt,
people ask me a lot, like, what books would you recommend? I was like, it's an insane field to try to learn from books.
Depends, though. I mean, I think hacking the art of exploitation is it's dated, but I think the concepts are there, and you can give that to I give that to freshmen, and they go and learn stuff from there. The Web Application Hacker's Handbook, I think, is kind of a good overview guide that can get people into, the basics and thinking about web hacking. But I think the overarching point is that people are very different in terms of what I say this as recommendations in case people are listening.
About my attention span rather
or just
than,
your learning style, right? I agree. I mean, I also don't think I've learned any of this security stuff from a book, right? But at the same time, I mean, I'd learned a lot about at least the early days of buffer overflows from the Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit, article. So definitely not a book, but still something interesting there.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt you, Fabian.
Didn't interrupt. So I was also then just thinking that videos is nice because I like this looking over the shoulder of like a professional, also seeing how they work, and that gets completely lost in a text write-up. Just these small comments when somebody is like working through it. It might, if you are a beginner, like a simple comment like, I don't know, there's this random, like you can use SCP to copy a file. That might, for a complete beginner, if you just drop that like in on the side of a sentence, might be just the thing that helped them click something. And that applies to like all levels of skill. Just like a small comment on the side while you do something like this. For example, if we go back to like heap challenges, all these different fields and values, if you have a write-up, you might just like it's a whole web of different things that influence each other. And on a write-up, you might only focus on the things that matter. But if you in person explain this, you can just simply say, I ignore this value because for this and that reason, it's not important for this case. There's just so much more context when a person explains it. And then in a scripted way, it's just like, so the difference between scripted videos and just live recording, live teaching, even talks, it's just the condensed version, just that it's like shorter. It can just be a 30-minute or 60-minute video, talk can be condensed to like a 10-minute YouTube video if everything is like planned out what you want to say.
That's great. So then, yeah, that was going to be kind of my follow-up question is how do you approach those plans, right? Because there's obviously, if you went into every detail of everything, it may take, far too long to get to where you want to go. And so you have to be very strategic, I guess, about what things you talk about, what things you don't talk about. But like you said, you do want that ability to demonstrate and show a process and those kinds of things that maybe you don't get from a text medium. So how do you approach that kind of that fine line?
Yeah, that's the difficult part. Also, it seems in the end, I actually look at the length of the video. Like I used to aim at like 8 to 10 minutes. For whatever reason, now it's like suddenly 15 to 20 minute videos. But like I have like kind of like a time goal. It's roughly like 3 to 5 pages in like a Google Doc. That's like roughly the length of script that I want to go with. And then I just need to make sure to pack everything of, for example, a CTF challenge into that. And then I need to think about what do I feel like are key takeaways from this challenge, and I want to focus on that. And this can include a wide variety of things and differs from video to video. Sometimes I want to highlight actually like a wrong rabbit hole I went into. Most of the video might be about a mistake I was making, simply because I think that mistake was actually the educational part of it and not so much the other stuff. In other areas and challenges, I focus like a lot on just talking about the command line commands that I'm using, just because I think, that's very suitable for like an introduction to Linux or so. So it really, really depends on the challenge and what I felt like is a good takeaway from that.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, that's great. And then I think that the idea of kind of boiling down the approaches and focusing on different things, I think is very important and can highlight, I think you brought up a good point about there's a lot of ancillary skills that we often take for granted, right? When we're approaching these things, I think, and Jana, I think you can talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, this is huge. Just what you mentioned, like some videos you highlight commands you're using, right? You also mentioned earlier SCP, right? I have students in my system security course, and these are seniors, right? That have gotten to the senior year of school without having to use SCP, and they don't know it. Or they don't know how to necessarily use grep very efficiently, right? And so on really complex ROP stuff where you're not going to get a gadget spit out or a chain spit out for you automatically, they start suffering. There's all sorts of this little knowledge that I find we have acquired through a lot of trial and error, and a lot of very varied trial and error, where you might have to use the TR command in various crazy ways over the course of your life, right? In ways that the students approaching this haven't. And this is something that I've really struggled with in my course. Like, how do you get people, how do you convey all of this knowledge that you learned over so long in small steps, right? You need to remove new lines, for example, replace them with spaces. So you learn a specific way to use TR or something. But you can't just have a class where you spew, like, if you need to, remove new lines. Your idea of focusing some of these videos on how to, on kind of the nuts and bolts, and some of the videos on
it's like context sensitive, right? And I think that's the problem that you're talking about, Jan, is like, I think even, in my undergrad, we had a class at UCSB that was half C programming and half just like Unix command line and other
Yes.
skills. And we had this book that was, I always used to make fun of. It was called Linux in a Nutshell, and it was like 800 pages or something. And it was like, it was basically like
Exactly.
man
And so-
pages
so
printed
you're-
out. And yeah, it's like, yeah, you could go through and like understand, I guess, at a high level what those commands are, but without that context of like, oh, this is useful in this specific scenario and this is why.
Yes.
I mean, personally, the thing that I like to try to teach my students is, and it's almost like maybe a similar thing you're talking about, Jan, of so I find myself in a situation, right? Like, okay, I need to do, like Jan said, I need to translate spaces to new lines. Now the question is, okay, do I know off the top of my head a tool that will do that for me already easily? No. Then do I think that something like that should exist, right? I think that's part of it. And then 3, how do I find that proper tool? I think the thing that I was the worst about as like an undergrad and as a new person is I never read the documentation for anything. Like I would just like try stuff until it works. And like, so now I try to tell the students, like I try to drill into them, you don't know how something works? Great, read the man page on it. Like you want to understand how this function works? Read the man page about it. It'll tell you oftentimes when it's insecure to use and all these things. And if you don't, and that's how like building up that skill of learning to learn these tools, I think is important.
I consider a lot of my videos, like they are about a CTF challenge, but the CTF challenge is more like just this fluffy story around it to give it some excitement. But the video itself is more like, what comes to mind, I have videos about like some web challenges, or for example that Google XSS. Then it's not so much. That's just the story to keep it interesting. But the actual beef of the video is how to use the Chrome developer tools. And I think if somebody wants to learn Chrome developer tools, they look for a Chrome developer tools tutorial. But my video, I feel like, would be the better introduction for it, just because it's like a fun story-based thing. That's kind of...
Which I think actually goes, and maybe might be a very good segue into, making this sort of learning not just fun, but very approachable. Like you said, right? I mean, you read the developer tools documentation all you want, but or these tutorials, but in the end, this challenge has a goal and something you can contextualize. Absolutely agree with you.
Wasn't it, to give an example, Jan? Wasn't it? I mean, this is pretty contrived, but wasn't it Hikon CTF that had the challenge where you had remote command injection of only, I think, 6 characters at the start? And
maybe I think it was 4 and then went down to 3,
I think
or
it was 5 to 4 or something like
4.
that. And so for the 5 one, everyone started reading man pages of every 1 and 2 letter command, and we got to things like ed, and so people started figuring out how to use ed, which was one of the original. It's basically, it sounds absurd to say, I guess, in this day, but it's like a command line based text editor. So, but without like a GUI, like everything, all the editing happened on the command line. And so, people were reading the manual there to figure out what to do to try to abuse this stuff.
Yeah, and that was really interesting, actually, not just in, I mean, I often present this view to my grad students. Our advisor, one of our advisors, Chris Krugel, has this view of like what graduate school is in relation to human knowledge. Anyways, maybe that's a subject for a different podcast, or maybe ideally a different episode. But basically, there's knowledge is very general, right? And as you specialize in cybersecurity, you have this hyper focus on some specific like binary analysis or whatnot, right? But this challenge with ed was incredible in that it forced us to learn ed, right? Or I mean, I don't think that was even the intended solution of the challenge, but we solved it.
I'd say that's what you did. It wasn't forcing you to do that, but you did that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but we learned ed, and in learning ed, that's a very specific piece of knowledge that we've learned, right? And it's almost completely useless in real life. But in learning it, we started noticing connections. Like these are the same commands as VI, command mode. And so then suddenly, by learning deeply a new area, we kind of expanded our knowledge generally and found something very applicable, right? So it helps you understand more what the history, how VI came about. So VI turns out was in some way a more graphical, end curses, basically expansion of ed, and so forth.
So this is clearly why Emacs is better, because Emacs has basically always been around in essentially the same form since the early days, man. I was using, Emacs on a Lisp machine. Can't say back in the day, but I did that. Zmax, I guess, is what it was called. But anyways, it's a terrible joke.
Yeah, but that's a great example that you had there, because a lot of arguments that people bring against CTF is that they are like unrealistic challenges. And I find this so short-sighted. It's only things like one step ahead, but you should see that in the context of like the whole path you are walking. Sure, like ed whatever, like you say, this might not be realistic, but it adds to your context and understanding of everything around it. And in the end, I feel like these are actually the skills that really like separate you and make you really a professional in the field.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's I think an important point of one of the things I think that we can get out of CTFs from the educational perspective, right? And that, there's definitely truth to that saying that people who say that like, well, CTF challenges are contrived, and it's literally true, right? They are, created as a challenge for people. They're fundamentally not realistic. Because, if you want realism, I don't know, go do bug bounties or do stuff like that, or find bugs and sell them to shady governments or something like that. So, those paths exist.
It's also a terrible way to learn. If you sit down and I'm going to learn cybersecurity by finding a bug and exploiting it in Chrome, probably some people can do that. It's definitely not impossible, but CTF is hard enough to learn through.
So then I guess maybe we can talk about maybe ideals in some sense. So if there's an ideal way to learn cybersecurity skills, and maybe actually before we do that, we can talk about, well, what types of skills are we talking about, right? So when we're talking about this security or cybersecurity skills, what are the things that we want people to learn?
I mean, I would say the first obvious thing that people think is the most important is just the raw technical knowledge about something, like which tools kind of exist and how a computer works to apply it. But yeah, that's definitely not all of it.
Jan, what do you think?
Yeah, I see cybersecurity as a thin layer on top of understanding truly how things work. Right? I think a good example is microarchitectural attacks, right? Like Spectre. In order to understand Spectre and reason about not just existing, this is X dot, or here's a proof concept exploit. I'm going to script kiddie it into exploiting, some Linux system and so forth, right? To truly understand how Spectre works, you need to truly understand how caching works and how speculative execution works.
On a CPU, like a modern CPU, right?
On an actual CPU. And Spectre itself, the security implications, a thin layer on top of that. That's my view of what I'm a big fan of this concept that to truly master something, you should go one step further and get kind of adequate at one step further. And by getting adequate in one step further, you master the prerequisites.
I'm just blown away because you're the first person I met who also says that. I keep telling people to always overshoot a little bit and go for the hard CTF challenges. Ideally, it's just a bit too hard that you cannot solve it or barely solve it, but it doesn't really matter. In the process of approaching this really hard target, you learn so much better than just like going from the next basic to the next basic to the next basic thing.
And in that process, I think maybe the interesting thing, right, from an educational perspective, is by challenging yourself and taking yourself to that higher level, in the process of attempting to solve that, you're coming up with, I always think of it in terms of hypotheses, right? So I'm coming up with a hypothesis, okay, will this thing work to break this thing? And then you have to prove or disprove it to yourself and then move on to the next one. And it's the process of generating that, especially, so I'll say that the skill that I always want people to get is this adversarial mindset of looking at something, understanding how it works, like Jan said, but then not just with that understanding, then be able to perform like what if scenarios in your brain to think, okay, what if I did this? What if I did this? What if I was able to control that value? How could I control that value? And it's getting that way of, it's like kind of like a testing mindset in some way. Like I had the story I really like is I worked as a software developer at Microsoft, and we had, at the time, Microsoft was split basically into thirds of like dev, tester, PM, and the testers weren't just, you know, people clicking on things, but like designing test cases and things. And, you know, one of my first, as a, you know, very fresh new person there at Microsoft working, I developed this feature, you know, put out the basically now we'd say a PR or whatever, and then the testers were like, yeah, it's great, Adam, but it doesn't work on 2 monitors. And I'm like, what? like I didn't even think about that. Like that's like a, you know, it's just like I just didn't test that. I didn't even consider that, didn't think about that, right? And they, you know, by looking at what I had done and thinking through the implications, they realized, oh, we should test it in this scenario, and it came up with a bug. And so I think that's part of the way that we approach security testing, is thinking through what things didn't the developer think about, and what does that actually mean for the security implications here.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that was the big, I forgot why we got on this topic actually.
We're gonna go to, I was gonna go to what the ideal way of teaching kind of cybersecurity skills are. That's in right. Our minds. But before we get there, I want to talk about what kind of skills. So, you know, I think that's good. We've hit kind of this high level goal of what we're trying to get, and there's all these kind of, I think, a plethora of skills, right? Understanding, you know, depending on what area you're in, understanding assembly, understanding how binaries work, understanding how CPUs work, understanding the web and databases, and, you know, all of these different layers of the computing stack in some sense. And those are kind of prerequisites, right? But you can learn, I don't know, in my mind, you can learn as much of those as you want, but without that adversarial mindset, you're not going to really do well. And the flip side also works. If, you know, I've seen interesting things of students in their very early days. They, you know, will look at some code and I say, what's vulnerable here? Like, oh, well, there's an XSS, because if somebody could change this variable, it's like a string that's used in output, and a string used in output is a vulnerability. I'm like, yes, but this string is hard coded in this source code. Like, yeah. Like, okay, so, but the only way you could exploit that is if you had control of the source code. If you could have control of the source code, you can make it do whatever you want. So it's not really, it's like, oh. And so, like, you know, understanding how things work is separate than, you know, contextualizing what an attacker can do, what does that mean for the security of this system?
Yeah, I think with a lot of write-ups and the way how like talks are constructed, and courses and whatever are always about, like, you know, this ideal path, I did this and this and this, but in reality it's all these hypotheses, these wrong rabbit holes, these questions you ask yourself. Even if they sound ridiculous, they are not ridiculous, they are important to really dig into, like, how it works, and then what the security implications are.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to bring up some recent examples, I mean, you did the videos about the Google CTF XSS stuff, which was, I tried, you know, I was playing for a few hours and talking with some of our teammates, and we had gotten, like, you know, I was like, okay, if we can do this, then we can do these other 2 things, and I just couldn't get the like first thing working. And so, yeah, but then it's fascinating, you know, but we tried a lot of stuff to get to that point. Or there was I think it was Hack the Vote recently had the propaganda challenge of Hack the Vote. It was a super interesting, basically it was an XSS that happened a second after, so in a set timeout, a second after, and then that's where you could inject into, but before that, they set window.location to another page. And so you had to figure out some way to not have that happen. And I was digging into, I had read this paper that was talking about the upcoming, there's an upcoming specification and security, CSP security header that controls where you can go to from a given page. And I cannot remember the header name off the top of my head. I'll have to look it up while somebody else talks. But they said you could use this essentially to control that, because it's part of the redirection chain. So if you if I got them to go to my site first and then redirected them there, that policy would still apply to those pages. So I could whitelist certain pages. And so I kept trying this, but then of course it's like, but this is still a draft specification and it's not even implemented in Chrome. So I was like completely stuck. But I kept thinking of other ways, and we kept trying other ways, and it turned out it was a really clever way of using redirection on another page. So you could inject into, they had a playground and the challenge, and basically you'd inject JavaScript in the challenge page that would redirect it to challenge up to 199 times, and then redirect it to the challenge page at 200. And at that point, Chrome will say, okay, no more redirections. We've hit the redirection limit, and it won't redirect the window.location, which was like super cool. And it's like, oh yeah, I didn't get it, but like trying that was amazing. I think I learned a lot.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Yeah, that sounds to me like what I love about CTFs, that they force you to dig into these technologies that you otherwise would have never looked into.
And also it has a very clear takeaway, right? The takeaway, I think a very good CTF challenge from an educational perspective has one awesome takeaway, and that takeaway is, hey, you can control the ability of a site to redirect actually very easily, because you could do the same thing. Well, I don't know, it depends on how that counter is managed, right? But potentially you could do the same thing from any attacker site.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to think about. Yeah, I didn't think about those implications. And the header, the policy I was thinking of was navigate to. So there's a navigate to spec that, so essentially you could control, ads or whatever, so that a malicious ad can't redirect you or navigate you somewhere where it shouldn't. So, yeah. Anyways, so that's so then so then in the ideal world, I guess, how would you build? So and maybe the interesting thing we can talk about here is, Fabian, you talked about how you kind of are developing essentially these courses through your, like, a series of your YouTube videos. So how do you think that then contrasts with maybe traditional security courses? And don't worry, you will not hurt our feelings. We're very happy to talk about those things.
No,
we're also very disappointed in traditional security courses.
I started with like the binary exploitation playlist, which is like basically my only real like longer running course. All the other YouTube videos are basically independent and stand on their own. They completely vary in like the expected skill level, so there's no actual like progression. It has more to do with like how YouTube works, that people just come in and start watching the new videos, and they might go back, like watch something, but the YouTube experience is just different. So now I kind of just want to provide something that people can just watch and they can take something away from it. So it's not like meant as like a standalone, like the perfect like course or anything like this. I personally also like, I never like learned being handheld. Like didn't have a security course. For me, it was always jumping between topics and starting a CTF challenge, maybe abandoning it again, and like constantly jumping around. And so I want to explain to people that not everything is like a clear path, especially like web security is so intertwined and interconnected, these security issues, that it's like I find it very hard to come up with some kind of linear path through that. And I kind of want to convey that it's like okay, and maybe even the right thing to do, to just keep jumping around and take a little bit of knowledge from there, then a bit from there, then a bit from there, a bit from there, and slowly like the blurry picture gets clearer.
Yeah, that's great. And what about you, Jan?
Yeah, so I really like this approach, right? Of you end up learning without realizing that you're learning, right? Because here's a fun problem, like just a mind puzzle, and here's another puzzle, and here's another puzzle, and by the time you're done, you've gradually kind of pushed that knowledge out enough. You're needing a person's knowledge, right? Without quite them realizing it. My worry about this, what I've observed in trying to bring in new people into a CTF team, is that very few people actually survive in some sense through the difficulties there, right? So they fail at one challenge, even if they've learned something subtly, or they're starting to learn something. that failure stays with them and it impacts their confidence.
Yes.
And then the second challenge that they try, they're coming into this from the perspective, well, how far will I get before I give up? And the third challenge is worse, and so on. And eventually, you just kind of crush their motivation. And I was captain of shellfish during my graduate school career, and in graduate school, I think out of all of the people that we kind of tried to pull in to shellfish, unless they were already, there was this inflection point, right? Someone comes in not being an expert, and either in that first like 2 months they will go heavy crazy into CTF. We had a teammate like this that showed up, actually not at UCSB but at a shellfish site, showed up to a hack meeting knowing nothing, disappeared for 2 months, and then showed back up and was our best like exploiter, right? Either they do this or something close to it, maybe not in 2 months, but just you can tell that they.
I could give a high level example of people that we know who we won't name them because I don't know if they want to be named, but we had people who joined, asked us about joining the UCSB hacking meetings that went for basically 2 hours a week weekly, and we had some people who were physics majors and weren't even computer science majors, and they, we said, yeah, definitely join, here's the things, but it may be over your head and that's okay, but keep up with it. And then now these people are the people that Jan was talking about of finding exploits in Chrome and stuff. It's crazy to see that progress from those early days, because it does, and I think, and maybe then the question, so at least my philosophy in terms of teaching is, like, I could probably lecture and talk about buffer overflows and teach you about buffer overflows. I mean, I don't think that the concept is that crazy, right? I think it's a learnable concept, and I did tell this to some U.S. Congress people that I could teach them. I was confident I could teach them the theory of buffer overflows, but the real meat comes into actually, I call it putting fingers to keyboards, right? And actually kind of do several of these buffer overflows, and then you actually really start to appreciate the nuances and all the details that we're talking about. So I guess what's the best way, do you think, that we can get people to get that hands-on experience?
Yeah. I have to say, like, you as an educator at the university face a very different challenge that I'm like on YouTube teaching, because, like, as I mentioned, like, a core motivation is, for me, I make the videos how I wanted them to be, and I have been like a self-driven, self-motivating, and a person who is not hit down from like failing challenges. Like, that's just something I had, and so my style and my views and my experience has only been like that. But you need to pick up students, like, very diverse like fields of people, and somehow like introduce them and help them get into this field. So I think that's very different. And I get a lot of questions from people like, should I go to this university? Which course should I do? Which book should I buy? This all comes from this problem that they want to learn but don't know how. And my issue is that I only know like one way how I've done it and how I have designed my YouTube stuff, but it's might not be for them. And so I typically like my only advice I always give is like, do whatever seems fun to you, because like.
Yeah, that's a great point. Fun is the critical element. I mean, like, I think that's what I think pushes you past the failure, right? So you need kind of either a high tolerance for failure, or you need to understand that failure is literally part of this process. And to bring it kind of all the way back, I think that's what's so important about doing those, what you originally started with, those live videos, right? I think showing, and I guess it depends how that comes up in your scripted videos, but showing the mistakes that you made, I think, is critical. And for me, that was always the frustrating thing about reading text write-ups, is like, and I definitely, I've done a few like live hack throughs that I just threw up on YouTube and did absolutely no editing, because I looked at a 3-hour video and I'm like, there's no way I'm editing this. So I applaud you for the effort of doing that. So yeah, that's one of those things, but it's like nobody sees all the times that I'm just like Googling. Like they don't say in the write-up, okay, we got to this point and then we spent 2 hours Googling and trying to come up with ideas until somebody finally came up with this thing, and here's 10 things we tried that didn't work, and here's the 11th thing that finally did work.
Yeah. So for my whole, like, if there's like a timeline of my learning progress, then having access to these live streams that truly show how long you can get stuck on something, and what you just mentioned, everything is like, for my learning experience, is like a small sliver. That was like seeing GeoHot like failing around, and that was enough to push me through that, realizing that, and from there on out I was able to do like learn again and do my own thing. So like I think live streaming and this extreme long, like many hours of content, is like boring for most, but for a few people, it's the at the stage where they are at is exactly what they need in that moment.
Yeah, because hopefully, like you said, it helps you maybe when you've plateaued, right? And you're in the, I guess the most difficult thing is the unknown, right? If you knew what to go study, you could probably go study and figure it out, but if you don't even know what you're missing here to know what to get you unstuck. And that's some of the things that are so difficult about write-ups, is because they just present every step as the obvious next logical leap, but you're looking there. It's almost like, in some sense, this is the frustration I had as a kid and still now, of looking at like math proofs. I'm like, wait a minute, how'd you get from like 4 to 5, man? That step doesn't make any sense to me. Like I understand all this, and you really have to kind of build up that knowledge base to understand that intuition.
Yeah, what I actually find is really demotivating for people is when the step between 4 and 5 does make absolute sense and is obvious in retrospect, but there's no way that they would have gotten that going, from 4 to 5. And we see this a lot in science, actually, right? You see a paper and you read this paper and you're like, oh, well, duh. But then coming up with that initially, right? That is a, and then it's not just actually in academia. If you read the original Return to libc blog post, a mailing list post from like Solar Designer, and in retrospect, it's like, yeah, okay, this seems like a pretty straightforward thing, but no one had come up with that before, and that's
and like as coming at that specific thing from a learning perspective, right? I mean, I think it's clear that there's a big logical leap from the classic buffer overflow shellcode on the stack at a fixed address, and then your overflow is just spraying an address. So I think the level of precision you need is incredibly different from that versus a return to libc and ROP, right? So I think that it's almost like it's like qualitatively different because it requires so much precision, whereas previous things necessarily didn't. And like understanding that that's what's really needed there is very difficult. But once you get it, you look at it and you're like, well, of course, this is how that works. You build up function frames and they just get called and done.
Yeah. What I really like about like these moments in CTF where, or in the write-ups and afterwards, like realizing that was like something obvious and I didn't figure it out, is actually something that I find very, very important, because so I work in security professionally. I do like security audits, code audits, and web app pen testing stuff. And it's very easy to become complacent because like you see like the same basic issues always come up, and CTF challenges like keep teaching me that there's stuff I don't know or stuff I don't understand how it interacts with each other. And if I feel like if I didn't have CTFs, I would become like a very lazy and complacent person, not doing a good job anymore. What I should be, what I'm paid for, basically. Yeah, I really like this about CTFs.
I experienced, I was in, kind of more IT security before I got into CTFs and grad school, and I experienced exactly that complacency. It's very easy to get very comfortable if you don't have every couple of weekends some insane situation where you're like, what the hell?
And even better if it's like something basic you feel like you should have known but you missed it.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I always like to talk about Orange's web challenges, but, it'd be 6 lines of PHP. I understand PHP. I can read every line of code, and I still don't understand where this effing bug is. So, Yeah, I definitely also love those approaches. Okay, so then, and you touched on it a little bit, Fabian. So maybe we could talk about what kind of feedback so you've been putting these videos out there. You have over 500,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is very, very, very cool. And so what kind of feedback are you getting from people? So you talked about people asking for, other resources of where they can continue their education. Are people going into playing CTFs from watching your videos? What's the response been like?
Completely diverse. I have gotten like response anything you can imagine, but what I'm seeing a lot is that people want like more guided courses. Like I get a lot of requests asking, is that course, can I buy that course, is that good, or which books you want to recommend? Like they really want a bit more of a hand holding experience that I'm not really giving them on YouTube. So that's a very common pattern.
And that's a great piece of feedback, and that's, I think, one of the benefits of maybe more of a traditional educational style course is that it, like you said, and I think this is when you were talking about, being very self-driven. For you, you're going to go learn these things. It doesn't matter if you're in a course or your grade depends on it, but not everyone is really wired that way. And some people need that, push to do kind of the homework and the work that they need to be doing so that they don't remain in just this theoretical realm of like, yeah, I understand security bugs. It's like, great, get an XSS on this site. And they're like, it's hard. So maybe then that ties into, Jan, you want to talk about the Pone College philosophy and how that compares to traditional security education?
So I think, Fabian, you said something very interesting. You said,
said many
should I
interesting
buy
things.
This course? Yeah, you said many interesting.
One of the many.
One of the many brilliant things, but seriously, that you said is that when people ask you, sometimes they say, I think you said, should I buy this course or something along these lines, right? Because a lot of this material is very closed off. If you look at trainings, and I've had similar questions, right? People said, hey, there's this black hat training on iOS exploitation. Should I try to take it? And I'm like, yeah, but do you know, like binary 100 exploitation? I know, right? And like there's two problems. One is training out there. A lot of these courses are very advanced, and then two, a lot of them are very locked behind essentially paywalls. College courses are the same, right? You have to enroll in a university. So that's like the ultimate paywall. There's a lack outside of like CTF, outside of walkthrough videos designed for people that are super passionate and will just bang their head against the wall until the wall breaks, right? There's a lack of these kind of gradual course experiences. That's one. And then two, there's a very, like you said, again, a lack of these hand-holding things. So actually, Adam and I were walking to coffee one day, and we were chatting about like how would you handhold someone into being a CTF master, right? Our old teammates on Shellfish that are out there popping up in CV advisories constantly and so forth. How do you get there? And we started thinking about professional sports, right? Which is, I at least don't know anything about professional sports, but my impression is that if you're on a football team or something, you go out there and you kick the ball every day, right? You go out at 5 a.m. and you just like kick the ball to each other and try to score some baskets.
I actually do have experience with this. You do this even at the at the high school level. Like when I was did a few years of football, but my main sport was wrestling, and yeah, you'd train for 2 to 3 hours after school every day. Like 3 to 6 is roughly when we would have practice every day, and then you'd spend weekends also dedicated to the sport, going to wrestling tournaments and those type of things. So it brought up this idea. Yeah, go ahead, Jan.
I was going to say the weekends exist. That's CTF.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And the main point of that repetitive training is like the amounts of hours you are adding up is insane if you think about the time. Yeah, and so I assume like you realized if you put this practice into IT security and have suddenly thousands of hours of practice in some way or form, then that's getting you really far.
Yeah, and then we basically kind of took that lens and then looked at how not just we prepare for CTFs, but also looking at educational courses. So even like, in a super hands-on security course, like what I took at grad school that went through exploitation and had levels that were inspired, homework assignments that were inspired by over the wire that had you hacking levels, which is what I have now for my course and what I make my students do. I feel like that's a great way for students to learn. But even that, we realized, you're only doing a few buffer overflows, like a handful, right? You're not, and if you think about, I don't know how the education system works in Germany. I'm sure it's very good, but I don't know, when you're learning math problems, when you're learning the quadratic equation, you practice that multiple times of how to apply that and what does it mean and what are the results do you get, right? It's not like you do it once and you're like, woo, I've got this quadratic equation, I'm amazing at this, right? And so we looked at that. Can we apply that same practice mindset to something like cybersecurity education so that students practice, drill these concepts, and then hopefully in the CTF context, you have the sports benefit where the reason why you train all those things is so you don't think about it during a game, right? You don't, when you're there, you don't have to think about what to do. Either your coach yells it to you or you just know, okay, this situation, I just know to do this and I'm going to do it and see what happens.
Yeah. And I mean, I think again, if you find yourself in a game, in a CTF, and you have a ball and you have a goal, you have to have an instinct on how to kick. Right, you can't just like, okay, I think I've done this once before. Let's give it a try.
No, I was just saying that the instinct that you mentioned is, I think, the important part. Even with those math questions, it's not really about like that you are technically able to do it. I think I don't know, but I believe that the goal of doing this repetitively is that you develop an intuition for how these equations work.
Exactly.
And that you then later, with that developed intuition, can apply it to other stuff.
Exactly.
And with security, I think that's the same. There's like Halvor Flake has like a keynote at some conference that I really liked, and in the end, or in that keynote, he mentioned things that in security we teach a lot of like the bags of tricks, but we don't really develop like good intuitions for it. And the professionals, the top exploiters, they have developed an intuition through these repetitive practices and doing this thing over and over again. And I think that's basically in the end the goal, that you try to teach them this kind of an intuitive feeling for how systems interact and behave. And
exactly, yeah, that's actually one of the saddest.
Teaching that is super tricky.
So I read a book before I started as a professor. So they actually give you, it may shock people to learn, but we get zero training on how to teach or be an effective teacher, which is insane. I mean, we're essentially hired for our research ability. And so I read a book on college education to just try to, get situated a little bit. And one of the saddest things that I learned from this book is that some people will take a physics class and ace it, like get A's in everything, all aspects of physics, and then you present them with a real world problem that involves concepts of friction or motion or any of those basic physics concepts, and they can't do it. So like they've been able to do exactly what you said, Fabian, of just apply the formulas, but haven't updated their mental model of how the world works based on their understanding of this formula. And to me, that's the saddest part, because that is exactly what you want people to be able to update their mental model of the world, like you said, to understand bugs better, understand vulnerabilities better. For playing CTFs a lot, I think it's understanding CTF challenges better and trying to build up that intuition about the world.
Yeah, I would add that it's exactly the same in cybersecurity, right? Like you have students that have aced every course, including like C, learning C and data structure and so forth, and they don't understand pointers once they have to actually reason about them in the course of exploitation. Yeah, it's super tricky, and building that is not obvious. Adam mentioned we have no teaching training, just kind of trial and error. Actually, luckily, one of our PhD students was taking a course on education for some reason. I'm not sure why. Not that it's a bad thing. I just don't know what prompted him to do that. And he did a write-up on cybersecurity education and gave it to me to read. And so I got a lot of ideas on a course between that and this conversation about this a concept of how do we train up CTFers like we train up sports people.
Yeah, so tell me maybe about the Poem College, because I've seen it around. I have looked into it for just a couple of minutes. So maybe you can tell me how you kind of solve or try to solve these issues.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've solved them. I think we've created something that will force people to master some of these concepts. I don't know if we've really reduced the pain all that much. So it's hard to judge where the successes are coming from and so forth. But Poem College basically came out of this concept of practice makes perfect. Like we should go and have people, run these drills or whatever, right? To learn all of these concepts. What I often tell my students is, by the end of, for example, the memory corruption module of Poem College, you should be able to calculate, offsets in the course of doing buffer overflows in your nightmares, right? So the idea is this, right? We take security, or specifically Poem College right now is very heavily focused on binary exploitation. Right, and we split it up into the constituent parts with some times during the course where we tie it all together. And so we start with, for example, just abusing programs. I put that module in to force people to learn the command line, because some people don't know it. Right, you might have a module on shell coding, a module on sandbox escaping, module on reverse engineering, a module on kind of introduction to memory errors, overflows, and under-initialized reads and stuff, and so on, right? All the way through to ROP, race conditions, kernel exploitation, etc. And in every module, of course, I lecture about it, right? But you probably, hopefully, I think everyone agrees that a lecture is not a good knowledge transfer method. In and out of itself. So then on top of that, we have this practice makes perfect concept of tons and tons and tons of challenge problems per module. And it's not enough just to have a bunch of challenge problems. If you do 80 buffer overflows, but they're all exactly the same, then it's you might learn how to do offset calculations, but there's some core concept of underlying buffer overflows that you're probably not exploring very well. So what we have is something we talked about earlier, actually, that a good CTF challenge should have exactly one, but a good CTF challenge has a takeaway, a new thing that you learn about underlying technology, about something, and all of the levels, all of the challenges of every module are arranged into levels where each level introduces a new concept, right? And so you might have a straight up, buffer overflow without any constraints, in level 1 or whatever. And then level 2, you have a buffer overflow, but on the way between the buffer and the return address, there's a variable that you need to not destroy, like an index that's being used, and so on, right? And things get harder and harder and harder, and explore different aspects of the problem. When the ideal situations, by then, people have a very good understanding of what causes buffer overflows to occur, what are the implications, what are the different methods of control that an attacker might achieve using a buffer overflow, and so on. And then, of course, you face the challenge now of every module is basically a mini course in and out of itself, right? With an introduction lecture, and then all of these like different levels of increasing complexity. And there's just not enough teaching material or teaching time for it. So then, partway through our first iteration of Pwn College, I realized, shit, half the class is failing. This is going to be a disaster. And we went back to the drawing board, and I talked to students. I'm like, why is there such a big drop between level 3 of the buffer overflow and level 4 of the buffer overflow scenario? And it's just, there was too much unknown, right? Too big of that single step that they had to take was too large. And it occurred to me that you could make that step smaller by actually having a challenge that tells them what to do, right? So we have these things called teaching challenges, where the challenge says, hey, listen, between the buffer and the return address, there's a counter, and that counter is actually the index into the write buffer and the read buffer of a handcrafted mem copy. And as I do the mem copy, I'm going to print out exactly what the index is, what I'm about to read, and what I'm about to write, and what the index is afterwards. And then I find that people are like, oh shit, when they read the 79th, and then I tell them, oh, and the buffer is this length, and there's this distance between the buffer and the index, and this distance, and all of this is printed out, right? Of course, all of this you can get through GDB, but you have to know to get it.
Yeah.
So by printing it all out, people are going through and oh crap, that's what's going on. I am reading the index value right now. This is crazy, and I'm writing over the index value, and now the index value is this. And then it clicks, and suddenly we start seeing a much more gradual curve. And actually, what we see now is there's a lot of challenges. I think, for example, for the return-oriented programming, or maybe it was the memory errors, I don't remember. One module got up to 18 levels, right? And you might say, okay, well, this is a lot for students to tackle, in just one small part of the course. But at the same time, we find that when we have too few levels, that means we have big jumps in conceptual complexity. We find these students are working, and then they just hit a wall. And so you see 100 students solve these levels, and then 70 students solve the next levels. Right? And then that tells you, okay, there's either a walkthrough bit or a level missing between them. A lot of the times, there are different concepts that are harder with ASLR on, because a lot of randomization that comes into play, or things along these lines. And so you say, okay, well, let's have a level without address space layer randomization, and then a level with it, and then things smooth out, and people are able to catch up.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I think that's a problem with like the war games and CTFs, to not have like a good gradual difficulty curve, especially like war games. Smash the Stack was something I would solve a level, and the next level I was stuck for like a couple of weeks or so, or I would take a break and come back a couple of months later. And having the data, being able to see that with like 100 students where they fall off, that sounds amazing. And being able to fine tune then such a course, that sounds like a really, really good educational resource.
Yeah, the hope is that it'll be kind of I designed it so that people would be able to take it and also just turnkey use it in their own colleges, right? Or their own CTF teams or something along these lines, right? All the videos are on YouTube, etc. The tweaking, like you said, is very. For example, we completely rewrote several modules this year based on insights from last year, and then for next year, for reverse engineering, for example, we start out with a simple crack me, right? And then we gradually introduce more complex concepts, reverse engineering, more complex algorithms, and so forth. And then we say, okay, well, here is a crack me, but the verification is MD5. You're not going to break this MD5, right? And but the challenge will let you change 1 byte of memory, right? And so then, people start interacting with the binary in a way that they haven't before, and then we move into reverse engineering a virtual machine, right, and so on. And then there are, right now, the way we have it is up until that patch me, basically everything is good. Between the patch me and the virtual machine, there's a big jump in complexity that's not covered. And I think looking at the results and talking to students and seeing the difficulties there, the jump in complexity that's not covered is the concept that your input has bearing on the execution of the program in a more complicated way than just being checked for a yes or no right at the end. Right, and so far for the crack me's, the key gens basically that they have to solve, it's all about what is the input that'll make the program say yes. There's only one place in the whole program where that input is finally checked, right? But for the virtual machine, their input changes the operation of the program every byte, every step of the way, right? Because they're inputting and that's missing. So
Interesting.
There's just very clear things that this is how we over time evolved the material.
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's definitely not a panacea. I mean, I think you mentioned just the raw number of hours that add up, right? This is, I think, important, but also very difficult because these students have a full educational load outside of my class.
Yeah, and an issue I have, I get a lot of comments are people that are, for example, developers or work in an entirely different field and want and ask how they can get into security. And it's almost like heartbreaking to tell them that it requires a lot of experience, I feel like, to get into security and job. And so, I understand that students who have a lot of free time know they are also very busy, and for them it might also take a whole semester just on one introduction course.
And this is just binaries, right? This is the other crazy thing. So thinking about web security is
and it's just binary.
Yeah, I mean, because when I cover about a third of my grad courses on web security, and we have to. I can't assume any prior knowledge, so we have to start at the beginning, right? You have to talk about what is HTTP, what is HTML, what are URLs, how is this whole complex web structured? And then you have to, it's just crazy to me when you look at all the technologies that are required to understand the web. I mean, it's an insane list of soup of stuff that I'm sure, Fabian, you've kind of like me have just picked it up over time, right? It's you learned some of this in the past, or maybe because I also started as kind of a web developer who kind of dabbled in security. And so, it's I picked up PHP and JavaScript, and that's kind of just stuff I know, but now it's just so complicated and complex. It's a crazy kind of task to try to teach somebody about the security of all these things. Cool. Any other thoughts on, I think the thing that you made me think of, Jan, that I think it kind of ties everything together is that, creating these levels for your class that kind of do one concept. So they're here and you understand that their knowledge is at this level. And so you're trying to give them a step up that they can do, but not a huge step up such that they're never going to get there. I think there's actually an interesting overlap there between that and organizing a CTF, because in some sense that is the goal. Is with those challenges that you're creating, you also understand that the security level of all the people playing CTF is at a certain thing, and you are trying to either not necessarily take them to the next level, but like Fabian said, teach them some new concept or something new that you think is cool that you've learned or that you've discovered. And so how do you create a challenge that gets them to do that? So anyways, I just think that's a kind of a interesting way of maybe thinking about organizing a CTF in those terms.
Yeah, it's difficult.
For sure.
And everybody's on a different level. That makes it also hard to educate on security.
Yeah, exactly. Because for the top teams, they'll be able to close that gap. But for people who are further down, for them it may look like it's impossible, right? And it's only till afterwards. But like we've talked about, I think there's huge benefit in attempting to solve those challenges, because trying to bridge that gap is really important part of the learning process.
Yeah, and what I find with Pone College, actually, the thing I wanted to kind of fold back into this is, like I said, I give them extra credit for playing in CTFs. And the course is hard. Extra credit is important. And so students pile into CTF. I have something like about 20 students that maybe not every weekend, but they play CTF quite frequently. About 15 per weekend, right? And I tell them, yeah, you can play with the, super elite hackers at ASU if you want. They play harder CTFs, or you can make your own teams. And I think there are 3 teams that have come out of my class that are now playing and scoring.
That's
like
awesome.
Not winning, but they come back, and some weekends I have them submit write-ups, and some weekends they say, our team solved 27 challenges. I mean, they're CTFs with a lot of challenges, right? But,
Sure.
It's
still a success. Yeah.
Yeah, and Al's CTF was actually a great one. It had a lot of introductory problems that they were able to tackle, and it's so cool because you can see just from reading the write-ups, you can see that okay, this concept they got from the class, but this concept they generalized, right? And that or just over time, right? The first week, everyone was like, we sat there for the entire CTF and we didn't solve anything, right? And then gradually you start understanding that, holy shit, these people have learned how to Google, right? Whether that's from my class or being forced to participate in CTFs nonstop, they're now able to actually find write-ups, read write-ups, try to generalize that information. It was just very cool to see. And some CTFs are just incredible for beginners. Hacktober, I think, was an amazing one, for example. That just had, glowing reviews from my students. Or Down Under CTF. I actually, that was one of the first ones where I was starting to look out for, which CTFs are good for beginners. I actually reached out to Down Under on Twitter and said, guys, great job. Here's some feedback from my students that it's just incredible.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, so there are people out there. I think when we're writing CTF challenges, we have this strong desire to make super tough as nails challenges and so forth, because that's what the kind of upper echelon of CTF is looking for. But there are people out there that are hungry for introductory challenges that aren't war games, that don't have YouTube videos already walking through them, even if they share concepts and so forth.
Right, because there's something to be said for that competitive aspect, right, Jan, of it's, and especially if you're working as a team on things and it's a 48-hour weekend CTF, that's something that you can kind of really crank on as a group rather than necessarily working on you can always work on the next war game tomorrow, right? So it's easy to put off. Cool. Anybody else have any other topics they want to bring up or talk about?
Only a comment to the last thing. I mentioned earlier that I've been participating in that Cybersecurity Challenge Germany, which was a competition for students. It was bad CTF, but we took it over. Alice, the CTF team, and other past members took over the organization of that. We founded a non-profit for that, and that is obviously aimed at students and high school and university students. And our goal is to have educational challenges. And so we also tried, we had a specific introduction category that had always 3 levels. And the first level always came with a write-up or a video write-up even.
Oh, cool.
And then having small changes to that. And it was, for example, a binary exploitation challenge where just the next level was without canary, and then the next was with canary. But you had the write-up for the one without canary. And so just so you mentioned a few things that I will keep in mind for next year when we organize, because we obviously want to have a CTF that is intended for beginners or general learning purposes, not so much for the.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, and I think we need more of things like that Pico CTF. I mean, I think these are exactly the types of CTFs. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say these are exactly the kind of CTFs I think we need more of.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if we need to have some sort of a index of. So, for example, when someone says, "How do I get into this?" They just kind of find out. Like, for example, we've been this cybersecurity CTF presumably is open to everyone.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Pwn College is open to everyone. Obviously, LiveOverflow over the wire is open to everyone. But the LiveOverflow, your course on exploitation is open to everyone. Maybe a list of these introductory resources and also resources to learn the fundamentals. I haven't gone through your course, but presumably you don't teach assembly. Neither do I.
Well,
right?
I do actually, but
great.
I only brush over it briefly. I just want to I point out a few things. For example, I did C code, compared that to code, but also compared 32-bit to 64-bit code side by side.
Awesome.
Just as a way to learn assembly. That was kind of like my approach, for example. But very briefly
these sort of, I've been trying to curate some resources on Pwn College itself. Actually, would you mind sending me? I'll dig it up. The video, because that's a big.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Somehow students get to senior level of undergraduate education without ever having seen x86 assembly.
They are old videos. They are not up to my standard nowadays, but yeah, I still think they hold up. It's fine.
I'm sure they're great.
Yeah, that is very cool. Yeah, and then I'll put that on the Pwn College site.
Yeah,
Pwn College was a hilarious thing because right in the night before the first day of class in 2018, we were like, we have to write a framework, we have to write challenges. We have to, it was pretty good, pretty last minute, and I just like randomly went and searched for cool TLDs to name the class, and I saw college as a TLD. That's great.
Yeah, yep, it's a perfect match.
Is there an overflow TLD?
And unfortunately not. There's a WS. So I own LiveOverflows, but
there's no OW.
No, it sucks. Also, overflow.live is taken, which also is annoying.
That's a bummer. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's taken. I think the reason Pwn College isn't Hacking College or Hack College is that was also taken. But yeah, it's this whole naming thing.
There's one thing about, you mentioned that kind of like sorting or categorizing like these resources and so forth. For my videos, I had this idea, which I started, never finished, was I have a website, it's live, but it doesn't have lots of content. It's called hacking.app, and just fancy TLD, has nothing to do with the content, but it's kind of like categorizing my videos in the different categories. The idea is that what I mentioned earlier with, for example, the browser developer tools, you can click on browser developer tools. You want to learn about that, and then it brings you to videos that use that technology or tool in like obviously a playful, fun, cool CTF kind of way. I kind of like this way of splitting up the topics and sorting resources, but I've never really gotten around to finishing that.
Yeah. It's hard to do all of these things, right? It's easy to start a lot of them, and
in an ideal world, I would have my own CTF challenges hosted for all the videos, and would have written blog posts with every video and so forth. Yeah, that's a struggle.
Man, I know how much time all of this takes. It's insane. But yeah, I think you're just based on your inspiration on my students, you're doing a great, great job. So,
yep,
it's awesome.
We really like
a very important piece of the community.
Yep, for sure.
Thank you.
Cool. Anything you want to plug? Anything else before we finish up?
There's a cool project from thhe called securitycreators.video, where he is listing a lot of like the YouTubers and streamers that create like this, either like live content, edited videos like I do, like the whole range. So if you have not looked up other YouTube creators, they are listed there. And
securitycreators.video. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, this is so cool.
Yeah, it's on GitHub. Everybody who has a channel can like send a pull request to get added there. It's also always like randomized, the order. I believe it's like randomizing every hour or so that there's like no bias.
Fabian's all the way at the bottom. What the hell's going on?
Yeah, I think that's a cool resource. So if you have not looked up videos, or if you haven't found the creator you like yet, maybe that's a good platform to look around.
Well, that is cool. Yeah, that's a great. And thhe is doing this. We actually just recently had him on.
Yeah, he was great.
Yeah,
that's great. All right. Yeah. Okay. With that, I guess, Fabian, thank you for joining us today, and everyone watching, thanks for joining us today as well. I'm Zardus. You can find me on Twitter at Zardus. This guy over here is Adam D. You can find him on Twitter at Adam Dupay. Our guest today is LiveOverflow, and you can find him on Twitter on LiveOverflow. Right?
Yes.
That's okay? Good. I don't know. All right. Awesome. Cool. So we're CTF Radio, and you can find us online on YouTube or Twitter at CTF Radiooo. O, not zeros, and that's 3 of them, because we're making things as complicated as possible. You can send us questions through email, ctfradioo@gmail.com, and who knows, your questions may end up on a future episode of CTF Radio. Take care, and happy hacking.
Yeah, thanks so much. Bye.